Is cross stitch considered embroidery? Hi, my name is Elle. I'm a cross stitch artist and designer here on TikTok. Let's talk about the difference and the overlap between cross stitch, needlework, and embroidery. This is sort of going to be a broad overview about these three different terms. I'm not going to dive too deeply into a lot of the nuance here because there is a lot of history surrounding all three of these terms. I'm just kind of going to go on the technical aspects of what these words mean. So in the broadest scope, embroidery is going to be you using a needle and thread to make designs on fabric. So embroidery is going to be an umbrella term that includes both cross stitch and needlepoint. Under that overarching umbrella of embroidery, you'll see cross stitch and you'll also see needlepoint. What we tend to think of as embroidery is needlepoint in a technical sense. So that is going to be a whole slew of different stitches that you are using, typically on cotton or linen or silk organza, things like that. It's going to be on a fabric of some kind, and you're going to be doing different types of stitching to get different textures and different looks. Now, these patterns can be anything from script to realistic, like needle painting, and everything in between. The different stitches, I don't know, there are dozens of different types of stitches. Needlepoint has been around for like 30,000 years or something. I believe it originated back in China. And we have really added to this collection of different stitches that you can do over the years by creating new stitches and figuring out new ways to create different looks and textures and feels that, you know, are all very different from each other. So cross stitch also falls under the umbrella of embroidery. Cross stitching, the actual cross stitches that we do in cross stitch are a needlepoint stitch. That's why they both fall under that embroidery umbrella. So the cross stitch can be used in embroidery needlepoint, but it is not a super common stitch that is used in regular needlepoint. It is typically used only in cross stitching, or majority of the time it's used in cross stitching. There are a few other stitches that are used in both needlepoint and cross stitching, like back stitching, French knots, things like that. But by and large, cross stitch is the majority stitch that you're going to see in the cross stitching camp. So the other major difference that you're going to see between needlepoint and cross stitch is that cross stitch is typically worked on an even weave or Ida fabric. And so that is a fabric that has a specific weave structure to it that makes it easier to make very even and precise stitches. Now, you can use linens, even weave, Ida in embroidery, in the needlepoint side of things as well. Typically, you're not going to see Ida cloth being used, but you can see even weave and linen being used for that type of embroidery as well. But typically, you're only going to see the Ida cloth being used for cross stitch. And you also can see the cross stitches being used on other types of fabric in the needlepoint world as well. So there is some overlap, there are some differences, but both needlepoint and cross stitch fall under the embroidery category. And like I said before, embroidery is going to be anything that is needle thread on fabric. I will say needle thread on fabric to make designs. Sewing is not into this category, although you can hand stitch with sewing and things like that. That is not considered embroidery unless you are doing fancy designs with it. So the short answer is yes, cross stitch is considered a part of embroidery. The longer answer is there is some nuance there. Typically what we think of as embroidery is actually needlepoint, which is underneath the embroidery category. Embroidery encompasses both needlepoint and cross stitching. There is a little bit of overlap between those two. They're not completely separate, but they're not completely the same either. I hope that helps, and as always, happy stitching.